Greetings, Earthlings. I am coming to you today live from sunny, warm San Diego, California. Glad I'm not over there in Washington, D.C. yet in that post. But I will be soon, probably gonna. I have made several brief videos called Return to Innocence, Game Over. And they originally were to deal with a science fiction story. But the more I think about it, the more I think that it's just extrapolative fiction. It is actually fiction not set in any kind of future that's highly technologically based, not about advancements of that sort. It's more extrapolative from the standpoint of studying a slightly alternate reality that is dealing with right now, right here on planet Earth. I am going to serialize it and generate chapters, which I will read to you, and then you can just watch one chapter at a time. And I think this will be very personal and fun, and maybe I'll get some feedback, and you can help influence the direction of the story depending on your own experience with the similar contexts. Although, my God, I hope you've never been in a similar context than the fictional characters that I'm describing in Game Over. In Game Over, people get recruited into something like gangs or the mafia. And incidentally, gangs are the mafia. And some governments are both. And they are imprisoned within the context of their own lives. Most of them don't live in situations where there are bars on the windows or wardens sitting outside guarding the door, but they're in a prison nevertheless. In Game Over, one person in particular resists recruitment so vociferously for a system that takes really good, decent people who are well-meaning and bastardizes their lives and forces them through coercion and cruelty and torture and also temptations. And that makes her a hero to some, but it also makes her the target of jealousy. If I pause, it's because I'm getting a banner saying that the connection is destabilized, but I will come back as soon as that banner goes off. I don't think I'm being recorded during those times, but if I am, then that's why I'm just all of a sudden sitting very still. So, Game Over is about how one person pokes that bear, because you're not supposed to talk about being in this context. Once you've been recruited and you're something called brought in, you're not supposed to ever mention what has happened to you in your life. And the silence, as we all know, is part of the problem. Because if people won't talk about their victimization, other people can't help them triumph over it. So it's about time that the characters who have been brought in start talking out loud. In fact, they ought to scream. The characters in Game Over have been indoctrinated into a situation. It's almost like folklore or shorthand. Certain words are used in a certain way. You're not supposed to say something is beautiful or that you love someone or something, or that that's your favorite, or that that's your friend, because the system, once you've identified these things as beautiful, beloved, or friendly, will try to take them away from you. Because after all, it does not want you to be happy. It does not want you to have beautiful things that you love and friends. It wants you to be a torture victim. because people who have been tortured tend to be very compliant. People who have been tortured, and many systems of slavery know this, tend to want so desperately that the torture ends that they'll do practically anything to be free of yet another form or incidence of torture forevermore. The people in Game Over are offered such things like increased status, and this is what should and must scandalize any reader or anyone who hears the story. The people in Game Over who have been brought in, that their status will increase if they generate new victims through their loins. So the system wants parents because parents create new victims. And without new victims, the system would collapse. It's no fun to have a system of torture if you don't have anyone around new to recruit. So in the what we call the resistance in this fictional context, in the resistance, people who willingly, knowingly become parents and let their tiny little innocent babies be handed over to the game, which is kind of akin to being in the Lebensborn Hitler's eugenics program and handing your brand new infant to the Nazis to experiment on. I mean, really, it's pretty much like being in Lebensborn and handing your baby over to the Hitlers of the world. People in the resistance love babies and kids as much as anyone. Some of them have babies and kids, and after all, we were all babies and kids at some point, now weren't we? It's just that some of us were fortunate enough, I guess, to be allowed to grow up, and others don't make it all the way to adulthood because of the game. Parents are reviled. Parents are called the ultimate recruiters, and you don't go around willy-nilly planning a family when you are basically in the prison camp called Earth in this world. So you don't go there. The protection game involves people being asked to choose between one another's lives, including their own. Someone who might want to marry you, for example, says, well, if it comes to that, would you choose your life over that of my daughter or son? And if you say no, they know better than to marry you because you're not going to be willing to offer what's called protection, which is being willing to offer your life for their offspring. People are asked to choose between other things like their job or their house or their marriage or their children. One thing that is very common in this fictional context is that around the age of 2, people who are parents are asked to choose between their marriage or their 2-year-old kid. And in this game, a lot of people divorce when their children are only 2 years old because they don't want to put their kids at risk. So it breaks up marriages, it causes hazards from the standpoint of financial and social support and upbringing, and kids who don't have both parents happily, safely together tend to have a rougher time of things, as we all know in real life. Game Over gets into some pretty nasty business, and I apologize for even thinking of doing this, but it needs to be said. Game Over is not something that I could have ever sat around and conceived of myself. I don't have that kind of brain. You could have sat me in a room for 100 years, provided for all my needs, and said, Nancy, think of all kinds of social contexts and probable timelines that could be generated for humanity. And I never would have thought of this in 100 years because I don't have that level of evil and corruption in me. The, the return to innocence, game over process or context that I'm framing these characters in is actually a compendium or a composite of all kinds of things I've heard of from people who have been born and raised in the mafia, born and raised in gang situations, recruited into the mafia when teens or adults, or recruited into gangs when they were children or teenagers. So this kind of crap actually happens on this world. And I'm one of the only people that you've ever encountered who actually has the courage to talk about it out loud and in person. But others need to follow suit. In the studies of domestic violence and child abuse, we find that collusion is done for many reasons. People keep quiet about their torment and their basic, abuse and being held slaves essentially in their own families because they think maybe they'll be safer. They aren't. They think maybe the abuser will stop harming them if they keep quiet. But they won't. And out of courage for domestic violence victims in spousal situations and for people who've been battered as children, emotionally, physically, sexually, to actually talk about it and to tell on the abuser. But until the abuser gets made, until we actually point at the abuser and say, you're doing this to me, you've got to stop, or you're harming my children, or you're harming my pets, you're harming my pets and my children and me, and we're not as vulnerable as you think. We aren't gonna be your perfect victims because we're not gonna keep quiet. We're gonna keep talking about it. We're gonna squawk loud. We're gonna scream if we have to. But you're not going to keep victimizing my pets, my children, me, the rest of my family, my friends, or the world because it is time. It is time for a brutal, cruel system of enslavement to stop expecting us to make such good slaves. We're gonna scream and we're gonna scream loud. So, this context of game over talks about how people who have been corrupted and who themselves have been victimized, and many of whom become wardens in the prison because there are rewards. Oh my, there are some fancy rewards for being brought in and being compliant and being a good little slave who enslaves others, who makes other people good little victims. There's fame, there's money, there's a reputation. Oh, the trifecta. There are so many perks, ostensibly, to letting yourself be brought in and, in fact, becoming an enslaver. The people want to advance through the system just so they think they can get some relief. But by and large, they find out that the more they're expected to enslave others, the less they can face what they've become. They know that many of them would be so much better off dead than to become what they have become. So return to innocence is actually a very hopeful thing to say about this context, and it's the approach that I'm saying. I'm not saying, oh, this is a horrible world, and in this context, everyone is distraught and um, forsaken. No, it's a very optimistic piece of fiction, profoundly optimistic indeed, because I have the audacity to presuppose that these characters in this context might actually find their hearts and their souls. That these characters in this context might not only decide to have the courage of my convictions, not only decide to have the courage of the lead character's convictions, but actually decide to stop being willing slaves, to stop playing the game with the lives of others and their own life, because they realize on some deep, profound, epiphanal level, deep, deep, deep in their immortal soul, they start realizing that they have no right to ask such questions. Would you choose between this person's life and that person's life, and so forth? That they have no right to answer them. You don't have a right. If someone says, would you sacrifice that person's life to save your own? You don't have a right to answer that question, because you're not the force of nature that put that soul in that body. Therefore, you don't have a right to take it out. You're not even the force of nature that put your own soul in your own molecular form. And you don't really have a right, in most circumstances, to take it back out. So these people in the resistance who break the game like a bunch of sticks over their knee, they find their souls. The lead character is told frequently that she has touched the hearts of those who long since forgot that they had hearts. She has touched the hearts of those who forgot they had. And these people become triumphant, because these people reach deep within their own torment and their own history of being victimized and abused, and they see how clearly some of them actually advance toward the path of being abusive themselves and being a victimizer. And they go back in time. They find their own souls. They find their own destiny. They find their own dignity and integrity and morality and decency. And they refuse to play the game. It's called unanimity. And unanimity, as it turns out, has the power to save and change the world. As the power of love in all creation flows through these people's lives anew, they began to see their own hearts afresh, and they began to realize that they are going to be forgiven for all they've done and all they've become, because in their natural state, if they had just been left alone to develop as regular human beings, they would never, ever, ever have become as corrupt and evil as they have become. Now, if you see yourself in this somewhere, go ahead and start now. Because what we're going to do is we are going to continually break out of the frame. In the study of Return to Innocence, Game Over, we will discuss things as if in a fictional world. Because I think that's easier. It's easier to extrapolate and sort of distance yourself and see things sort of like a scientist in a laboratory. But many of us recognize the contexts that are being discussed here. Some people in militaries, some people in draconian countries, people who live in dictatorships, people who live in, domestic dictatorships with a narcissist or a sociopath or both. These constraints and these levels of victimization are all too familiar for some of you. And you know that I didn't just sit around and conceive of this on my own, but that I am gathering possibly even from your own life and creating a context in which this can be discussed freely. Because people, we need to free the slaves. Slavery is not something that Abraham Lincoln managed to cure with the Emancipation Proclamation. Certain types of slavery did end by that noble cause and that extraordinary gentleman and his cohorts, and the efforts they made to do so. Over the course of the last 2 decades, I have heard different estimates about the incidence of slavery among human beings in the 21st century. I originally heard that there were approximately 26 million slaves worldwide. And that shocks people because most people in America aren't accustomed to thinking about that. Much more recently, I've heard that there are approximately 46 million slaves worldwide, which is quite a jump, quite a leap in the estimate. But when you consider the number of people who are in draconian, abusive contexts, when you consider how many people who have literally been enslaved in things like the mafias of the world or gangs or even domestic violence contexts, I think you'll agree with me that there are a whole lot more slaves than that. And it's slavery, as it is expressed in human social interactions in the 21st century, runs rampant in our world. And I am creating Game Over, Return to Innocence, because I want to battle that. And I want to free the slaves. I hope you will join me. Let's talk about this. Let's talk loud. This is Nancy Love. Game over.